morning, everybody. First, before I begin, a couple of logistical hot topics. Number one is in a bright orange color toward the top of the slide. This is a repeat session that John and I did on Tuesday. It was pretty popular. It was well reviewed, so we figured we should go ahead and do it again. So if you saw 3184 from John and I on Tuesday, you're not going to see anything in here other than me potentially falling off the stage, which may well be a reason to stay. Second topic I was going to mention. Thank you for your dedication. I cannot believe you are still here. In your shoes, I would have left yesterday. So well done for that. So first up, this is a session on Azure automation and how you can use it to manage your entire estate. We're not just talking about the stuff that's running up in Azure, we're talking about stuff that's running just about anywhere, and yet you can use Azure features to go ahead and manage it. My name is Dean Wells. With me, I have John Messick. We're both PMs in Azure Compute. Specifically, we're on a team known as Azure Shell and Hybrid. We're also the same team that owns Azure Ark, and I'm sure you've seen that repeatedly. So this is the team that does that stuff as well. So let me see if this is working. It is. Fantastic. So our session objectives. The first thing I really want to do is validate that we're all on the same page, because there is a misconception that's still there for some people that aren't yet even mildly into the cloud, that the cloud is just about storage, compute, and some security stuff. It is far more than that these days. The second thing, I want to take a look at the breadth of Azure's management capabilities. There are so many of them. You're going to be pretty surprised if you're not familiar with Azure as it stands today, just how many things it's already capable of doing. The rest of the bullets here kind of make sense, but they all follow the same kind of track. I want you to understand one thing, though, when you leave here. All of the stuff that we're talking about will eventually be able to be used just about anywhere because of Azure Ark. So one of the points I've been making to most folks is Azure Ark is cool by itself. Azure Lighthouse is cool by itself. Azure's suite of management services are cool by themselves. But when you start combining these things together in clever permutations, you get scenarios that weren't even possible before. So this is actually a worthwhile thing. Start thinking about how Azure Ark plus Lighthouse plus some of these services would make your lives easier, especially if you're managing multiple tenants, maybe you're a managed service provider, or if you've got a dev test setup that's entirely separated from production. Lighthouse, Ark, and this stuff all come together to make that life or make that job far, far simpler. So level set and context, let's kick it off. This is what most people think the cloud is. Just a bunch of PCs running massive Hyper-V hosts with lots of VMs, gobs of storage, and some security stuff. It's actually far more than that. Azure really is the Swiss Army knife of management services, security services, and automation services. It does so much. There are a couple of things when I first started looking at Azure, obviously for me being a Microsoft employee, that was some years back, but a couple of things jumped out at me. One of the big ones was referred to as infrastructure as code. I'd love to get a quick show of hands. How many of you know what infrastructure as code is? Good, that's a far higher ratio relative to the audience size than we had last time. For those that are not familiar with it, it's basically this ability to use declarative language, a declarative syntax, to simply reproduce or define an environment of your choosing, and then you can redefine and rebuild that environment exactly the same every single time. So I define it once in an ARM template, ARM being Azure Resource Manager. I ask Azure to go and execute that template or ingest it, and it starts spitting out virtual machines that can have policy applied, in-guest configuration, VNets, and all these other cool things. That's what we refer to as infrastructure as code. To those of you that deploy infrastructure on premises, this is a fantastic solution for making sure something that is deployed and redeployed frequently is identical every single time. There's really not much else that can do that quite as well. So the other part about Azure that is not well known is it is hybrid by design, and it is also OS agnostic. John owned a technology in Azure for a long, long time called Azure Update Management. John's Azure Update Management offering can patch Windows servers in Azure. It can patch Windows servers on premises, but likewise, it can also patch Linux. Most variations, most builds of Linux, it's able to patch those too. That isn't something that the vast majority of folks know and understand. So another quick level set then, the shift to the cloud. Obviously, there is only one cloud because none of you are in another one that begins with A, right? That's what I thought, and certainly not in the one that begins with G. Boo, well said that man. Good to see, good to see. All right, so we have this shift in IT management. The way that it's worked on premises for years, I don't know about any of you because I can barely see any of you. I've been doing this for about 30 years now. And when I was down sort of implementing NT solutions or Novell NetWare solutions, there's a quick poll. Who used Novell NetWare? Oh, look at that. Yes, NetWare, the product that literally lost the market. It had sewn up overnight. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but there we go. Back in those days, it was all about central IT. You had an IT department with policies. They would push it out, and people that owned and ran applications on that network, they had no choice. They had no say in the matter. That's still the case in many organizations. The cloud allows you to change that if you choose to. It's not necessarily bound to being delegated. It can do both delegated and centralized. But what we're seeing is this shift to more delegated, where central IT is saying, it is feasible for me to delegate control to application owners. Not the technical stuff, not the deep down in the weeds of configuring an IP address or using DHCP versus static or IPv6 versus, not that sort of stuff. When do I want to be patched? When should I be rebooted? I can delegate those things now using Azure, and in this particular example, Azure Update Management, whilst maintaining the central control that is enforced, the guardrails, by central IT, i.e. if they don't patch themselves within 7 days of a critical security patch, we will patch it for you and we will reboot it on our schedule. If you want it to not be on our schedule, then you need to do it within those guardrails. That's really what I'm referring to there. All right, so that then leads into this next topic, which is as follows. Most people think of the term hybrid as referring to where their infrastructure resides. Some of it's on premises, some of it's in the cloud, some of it's in those other two clouds we just mentioned, but of course we all agree none of it really is. But what I'm pushing here is not just hybrid infrastructure, hybrid management. This is what Azure offers. You don't have to use existing tooling on premises when you go to Azure. People are aware of that. They replace an on-premises backup tool with Azure Backup. But what a lot of people don't realize is I could actually use Azure Backup for on-premises machines. And then with Azure Ark into the mix, you can literally use, going forward, we're not quite there yet, we have to arkify, if I can use that word, a few other components. But at that point, you could use Azure's entire management suite to manage virtual machines running Windows and potentially Linux anywhere on the planet. They could be in AWS, they could be in GCP, they could be in a data center, or they might be in Azure, it doesn't matter. You'll be able to use the same management pane to manage all of them, regardless of where they are. Then introduce Lighthouse, and now you can manage across tenant boundaries with single policies. One policy, 10,000 tenants, if you wanted to. That's the capabilities that these things offer. All right, so the first one, System Center. On-premises tool or cloud tool? Real quick.
Neither.
Oh, nice. On-premises tool or cloud tool, and the correct answer came from the front, neither. It's both. System Center can do both. Certainly, there's a product that John also knows extremely well called System Center VMM. It has multi-tenant capabilities. It has the ability to actually understand the concept of tenant boundaries. These tools are capable of working just about anywhere, but the vast majority of people would consider to be System Center as their on-premises management suite and Azure as their cloud management suite. A lot of people say, which one should I choose? The message we're trying to push is, while they have the same capabilities, you don't have to choose. You can use one from one side, one from the other, or if you like, with the Azure Update Management example, use both. Use System Center Config Manager to enforce the guardrails of patch management, and then use Azure Update Management's delegated management capabilities to allow app owners to choose what their patching schedule is and what their reboot timeframes are. So you can literally use one, the other, or both in unison, and this is what we refer to as co-managed. All right, let's move swiftly on then. So, quick summary. The central IT model is still preserved. You can still use that if you wish. If you've got a slew of management packs that you've invested in, you can continue to use those. You can also onboard with Azure and start using Azure's facilities to replace what you've got on-prem. So you've got a third-party backup solution, you could start using Azure Backup. Or you can simply dip your toe into the water and start using them both together. Allow central IT to preserve the policy boundaries and allow Azure to provide you with that delegation capability. So what I'd like to do is hand it over to John, who's going to talk to you about a few of the Azure services, starting with the one that he knows most inside and out. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Dean. So update management is the common denominator that everybody who has to deal with server management deals with, and how we can do that in a structured way across our environment. So the first service we're going to look at today is Azure Update Management. Now, Azure Update Management is a no-cost service in Azure which enables unified patch management across your environments. And this works not just in Azure, but as on your non-Azure machines as well, whether that's on premises or in other clouds. And it works across a variety of operating systems, including Windows, as well as all the major distros of Linux. And it doesn't just work in isolation. We have integration points with many other Microsoft services and applications. So for instance, you can use Azure Monitor and Log Analytics and Azure Security Center to monitor the patch status across your environment. You can use Azure Stack and System Center VMM, as well as Windows Admin Center to onboard onto update management. And then you can also import your existing logical groupings from on-premises through integration points with Active Directory as well as System Center SCCM. So let's go ahead and navigate over to the portal and take a look at Azure Update Management. So here we are in Azure Update Management. As you can see, we get a single pane of glass view across the environment of the patch compliance of our machines. And today, in the environment that I'm going to be showing you throughout the demos that we're going to look at, I've got an environment set up that's got a number of Azure machines, and these are a mixture of Linux as well as Windows machines. And I also have a couple of physical servers that are sitting back in Redmond in my office. And Azure Update Management, as you can see, can manage across all of those, and we get a status, compliance status across those. We can also inventory the missing updates across the environment as well. Finally, I have several deployments set up so that I can do managed patches across my environment on a regular basis. So I've got a couple of deployments set up for running on Saturdays, running on Sundays, and a couple of monthly ones as well. And the idea here is that for the purposes of these demos, I'm acting as kind of central IT, and I'm setting up an environment where I want to enable self-service management for my self-service users, application owners, and DevOps teams. So by doing this, I've set up some structured patch deployments, and the idea is that I want to allow my users to pick which ones they want their machines to participate in. So I want to quickly look at how to create one of those deployments, because we have Azure Update Management has native integration with Azure specific concepts. So I can come in and say, hey, I want to create an update deployment that runs, for instance, against my PM subscription. And I could narrow it by resource group as well as I like. But a lot of the real power of this comes by specifying tags. So I can come in and specify, hey, I only want this update deployment to patch machines that have a specific tag on them. In the case of my environment here, what I'm doing is setting up all my deployments that we saw to key off of a tag called maintenance window. And so, for instance, this deployment that I'm creating here, I want it to only target machines that have a patch deployment or a maintenance window set to Saturday. And if we ran that right now, we could see that it would target my 3 Windows servers. But this is dynamic, so now my self-service users can come in and just tag the VMs that they own with specific tags of when they want their machines patched. And this is also really powerful, so for instance, if they have blackout dates, if they're rolling out a new product and they don't want their machines down for servicing, they can simply remove that tag for a week and their machines will skip a patch cycle. And they don't have to come to a central IT operator to do that. They don't have to have access to update management. They only have to have access to their resources. So the next service I want to look at is change tracking. So change tracking enables you to reach into your servers and bring change status into the cloud so that now you can do analysis of all the changes that are happening across your environment and do that within the cloud. And you can do that even if the servers that you're tracking have gone offline. So this is really powerful for doing diagnostics in your environment. So if, for instance, your network quit working over the weekend, you can go into change tracking in the cloud and examine exactly what changed in your environment over that time period. Now we're going to jump back to change tracking in just a moment and see what that looks like in the portal. But I want to talk a second about one of its sister services. It's installed with change tracking, and this is inventory. And this is really about gathering a comprehensive list of assets across your servers. So you can do things like inventory the operating systems that are deployed in your environment. You can inventory what services and what the status of those services and daemons are across your environment, as well as things like what the software is installed. And you can set alerting on that as well. So for instance, if you have some blacklisted software in your environment, you can set up alerts so that if somebody goes out to one of their servers and installs this software that you don't want in your environment, you can immediately be alerted to that or create tickets or create reporting on that as well. So I'm going to switch back to the portal. And here we have a view of Azure change tracking. And as you can see, we have an at-a-glance view of exactly what's changed across all of my servers. And again, this is not just in Azure, but also my non-Azure servers as well, across a period of time. So in this case, I'm looking at the last 7 days' changes. So we can see that it looks like there's been a bunch of software changes, and that typically corresponds to patch updates, for instance. And we've also had some file changes, as well as some daemons that have changed status. And this is really great for troubleshooting. So for instance, going back to that example I mentioned before, let's say that I started having some network issues over the weekend and a couple of my servers aren't talking to each other. I can very easily narrow down the time frame and then look and see exactly what changed just during that period. So this is a contrived example, but we can see here that in this case, if I look down at the changes, there's some software changes, some antivirus updates, but then there's also been a file change. And here we can see it happen in the host file. And I can actually pull that up and get an in-the-cloud diff of exactly what lines in that file changed. So it becomes very easy to diagnose changes in your environment. So the last service I want to talk about before I hand it back over to Dean is Azure Policy. So Azure Policy enables you to create, audit, and make changes to your configuration policies and governance rules within your environment. So this typically happens at the ARM layer. So you can specify things like, hey, I only want VMs of a certain shape to be deployed into my environment, or I only want certain virtual network settings to be deployed in my environment. And again, this is really great for the central IT self-service scenarios because central IT can put governance rules in place in the form of policies, but then still allow those self-service users to work within those guardrails of those policies. And you can audit those policies and make remediation changes if you need to from either central IT across all the resources or even the self-service users for those few assets that they own. But Azure Policy is not just for the ARM layer. It can actually reach into your servers. So there's something called server configuration that allows you to create policies that reach into your VMs and into your servers and modify and push configuration and audit within. So for instance, you may create policies which audit that your password complexity on your servers have a certain complexity, or that certain protocols are prohibited or must be used within your servers. And you can do that all from policy now and push those changes down into your VMs. So I'm going to switch back to the portal again and look at policy. So again, in my demo environment here, this is just one single resource group, but the same concepts that I'm showing you here today can be applied at higher levels. So you can do it at not just resource group, but at entire subscription levels or even management groups. So in this case here, I've got 4 policies that I want to look at. And the first one is, and what I'm trying to do with these policies is set those guardrails in place for the self-service users. So the first thing I want to do is ensure all of my VMs in my environment are onboarded to update management. Now, update management and some of the other services we've looked at are built on top of Azure Monitor and Log Analytics. So to onboard to update management, that simply means installing the Azure Monitoring Agent and pointing it to the right Log Analytics workspace. So I've created a policy here that will do exactly that, and that's enable Azure Monitor for VMs. Now, Azure policies have an effect type, and there's several different ones we're going to look at, but this particular type of policy has an effect type of deploy if not exist. And what this means is that when I deploy a new VM into my environment, this policy is going to kick in and examine that VM. And if it doesn't have the monitor agent installed, it's going to automatically install that. And it's not just for deployment time either. Over time, I can audit these systems and understand and ensure that that monitoring agent is still installed and create alerts if it gets removed for some reason. So now I've ensured that all the VMs in my environment are onboarded to update management. But it doesn't mean that they're being patched, because if you remember from the previous example, to be in one of those patch maintenance groups that I specified, it has to have that maintenance tag with one of several predefined values. So I've created a second policy, and that's enforce maintenance tag and values. And what this policy does is, as you create a new VM, it verifies that that tag exists and it contains one of several predefined values. And we can look at that real quick here. So this is the policy definition for enforce maintenance tags and values, and it takes a couple of parameters. One is the tag we want to enforce, so in this case it's maintenance window. And the second is, here's the set of allowed values. And the policy effect for this one is deny. So if a user tries to create a VM in my environment and they don't specify this tag with one of these predefined values, then it's going to deny creating that resource. So now I've ensured that no VMs in my environment can be created unless they participate in one of those patch groups. But I wanted to add one final one, because I do have a lot of users who are casual users of, they're casual users and they're creating VMs maybe just for test purposes, and they don't necessarily care about when their machines are patched. They just need a machine to work with. So I don't want that to be a bad experience for them. I don't want their VMs to be denied when they try to create them. So I've created one final policy which has an effect type of append. And what this policy does is apply a default maintenance tag and value. So if a new VM gets created in my environment and it doesn't have that tag with one of those predefined values, it's going to put a default one. So it's going to put a maintenance window with a default value of Sunday. So those casual users that come in and create a VM are just going to have their VMs thrown into a Sunday patch schedule. And I want to touch real quick on one final policy. And that's, as I talked about earlier, it's an in-guest policy which is going to audit insecure passwords. So I've started not just taking my policy and governance to not just in the ARM control plane, but also into the VM with this. So now any VMs that come into my environment, I can start monitoring in-guest to make sure that they have secure passwords. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Dean.
Thanks, Bud. Okay, so there were 4 specific services there. These are 4 that always jumped to the top of my list when I sort of joined the team that John was on beforehand, and he showed me this stuff, along with a number of other services. These were the 4 that really resonated with me as incredibly capable. So again, the point I'm trying to make now is combine those with Ark. Once they're all archified, and I'm not saying they all are yet, because we're still working to make sure everything works with Ark, you now have that change tracking, that inventory, Azure Policy, plus server configuration that can extend to any Windows server, and obviously going forward, Linux running anywhere on the planet. We don't really care where it is. As long as it can reach us on 443, then we can manage it. These things are extremely mature offerings. They've been honed over the months and the years that they've been running in Azure by feedback from customers like yourselves, and they're now extremely mature, and they tend to solve most people's problems because we got that feedback from you. What isn't mature is John and his engineering team when they gave names to update configurations in update management. So John, I would like you to tell the audience the 2 phrases that you use when having engineering discussions about Azure Update Management specific to update configurations.
There's software update configurations and software update configuration records.
What does that come out as, folks? So you listen to one of John's engineering discussions with his dev manager and a team of 5 or 6 devs, and the entire conversation is dominated by the words suck and sucker. So yes, while we have mature services, we do not have mature staff.
We also
John,
have software update configuration machine records, which are suck-mores.
I didn't know that one. Yep, sorry about that. I can tell you the products are good, but hey, you'll have to just take a look and just ignore the people that own them. All right, moving swiftly on. Azure Monitor then, we've talked about getting an asset inventory, we've talked about monitoring the changes that occur to those machines, we can now enforce policy on them. Of course, you need to have monitoring capabilities. Azure Monitor has been around for quite some time as well, and it's continuing to receive a heavy amount of investment. This thing is able to monitor an unbelievable amount of statistics and various things, but one of the core things it does, it allows you to look at your infrastructure from a very high level, that top-down view where you might see a symptom and another problem over here, and without having something that can take this 3 steps back view, you'd never be able to correlate that the cause you saw over there was actually related to the symptom you're seeing over here. So from that perspective, Azure Monitor is very unique in that set of capabilities. How many of you have used Azure Security Center before? Yeah, that's quite a few of you, good. Azure Security Center is absolutely a top-notch product. This thing is artificial intelligence backed, i.e. it has AI at the back of it figuring out what's going on in the world. One of the greatest things that Azure Security Center brings to the table for me is if there is some poor candidate customer over in, let's pick a place, France. There's a poor candidate customer over in France. You know, I love the French, being British. Anyone from France in here? Okay, I can really rag on them now. Okay, I don't really love the French at all, but I'm teasing. There's a machine over in France and it gets infected with a virus. If Azure Security Center is there, one, it's got to be brand new or Azure Security Center would have already picked it up. So it's this brand spanking new, it found a way in. Once Azure Security Center detects it and it's able to quarantine it, that data is then lifted back up into the cloud, and anyone else that's subscribed to Azure Security Center within a very brief period of time starts gaining the benefit from the fact that Azure Security Center found it in France, and now we're going to apply it protections in England, because that's the logical thing to do. So we use the French to test the bad stuff. Is there still no one in France? No? I can keep going with this. All right, fantastic. Moving swiftly on then. Azure best practices. With all these services, you guys have got to figure out which ones do I subscribe to. Do I subscribe to ASR, which is a recovery or disaster recovery mechanism? Do I use Azure Backup? What's the configuration? Do I use Azure Monitor? Do I use Log Analytics? What is Log Analytics? It's very difficult to know what you should do when you come to Azure, and we're aware of that because it has so many capabilities. So one of John's and mine peers, Jane, she put 3 to 4 months of work into trying to figure out what would we, from the Azure team, determine to be a best practices configuration. And we documented that for you. So we now have a white paper that was 3 to 4 months of solid, devoted work trying to figure out what exactly best practices looks like. And that isn't just within the guest or in terms of the services that the VM is onboarded to, it's both. The result of all that effort is a white paper, and that white paper is available to you guys now, and it looks something like this. Everything in there is actionable. I get it's a 6-page white paper and it looks rather complicated and stuff, but it is 6 pages of directly actionable steps, and you can adopt those steps progressively. You don't have to do it all in one go. So you can do that, which is relatively easy, or if you like, you can go ahead and do what John is about to show you, which I would argue is a tad easier. John?
Okay, so let's do what Dean just showed us via our new Azure Best Practices tool. So the first thing I want to do is select a set of machines that I want to apply it to. So I'm going to go into my Ignite demo. I'm going to select a couple machines. And next I'm going to hit the Enable button. And go ahead, Dean, I'm done.
So you could do it with the white paper, which, as I said, Jane put an awful lot of effort into, but we've also now translated that into a prototype. This is not available yet. We're continuing to work down this path of automation technologies that take what are otherwise complex reconfigurations and ongoing insurances that it is still in that configuration, i.e. it's born that way, it dies that way, and during its life cycle, the runtime, it stays that way. We're continuing to invest in those sort of automation technologies. John, show them a couple of other aspects of how that works, if you would.
Yeah, so there's actually a little bit more to it. So let's look and see what I actually just did. So first of all, I decided to enable it on an existing VM. And what enabling means is associating what we call a configuration profile to that machine. A configuration profile contains the capabilities and services that we're going to apply to that machine to make it go in line with a certain set of best practices. So today we have 2 different configuration profiles. We've got one for production machines and one for test and dev machines. Now, if we look at what one of those looks like, we can see all the set of services that get enabled with this tool against those VMs that we associate it with. So here you can see we have a set of operational capabilities such as update management and backup and cloud fit. monitoring through Azure Security Center and log analytics in Azure Monitor. We also enable change tracking and inventory, which we looked at earlier, as well as pushing an in-guest configuration baseline, which will enable in-guest policy. Now, we've got two of these today. Like I said, the one for production and one for test dev. They're very similar to each other. The test dev one has a few less capabilities. We don't have backup and we don't have change tracking because we feel that's not really something that you need to worry about. That's in dev test machines. That's really a more production environment. And then as time goes on, we're going to have more capabilities added to these. Dean?
Thank you. So this is, as I said, a prototype. John showed you the difference between production and dev test. That's actually not just the name. There is a formal question when you're creating a custom configuration profile, which we will ultimately allow you to do once we release this into preview and then on through general availability. We ask you that question, is it production or is it dev test? We ask you that question because it allows us to make a huge number of inferences. If you tell us it's production, I'm going to back it up. And I'm going to back it up with a reasonable frequency. I'm going to have backup shelf life retention of 3 months, whatever it needs to be. You get to customize. But the reason we ask that question is so that you don't have to customize. We can make those assertions for you. Because if you tell me it's dev test, am I going to invest a lot in backup, which you're going to pay for? Not for a dev test machine. But am I going to make aggressive efforts to ensure that that dev test VM is the cheapest VM it can possibly be without compromising the dev test effort? Yes, I am. I won't do that for a production machine unless you tell me to. So we'll have all of these kind of capabilities that are built into this method. So with that little teaser, can I just get a quick show of hands? Who would find that to be a valuable capability? Excellent. John, what was that, 75%, something like that? Okay, good, thank you. All right, let's move on past that then and give you two things that are totally new. The difference between what we just showed, which is a prototype and not yet available. These are actually available either in preview, private or public, or they're fully released, such as Lighthouse. So let's start with Azure Ark. I know you've seen this already, so I'll give you the basic synopsis of what Azure Ark does. This is obviously supposed to be funny. You can't possibly read what's going on the right-hand side, but basically we got lots of feedback from customers saying, it's great that I can use Azure Update Management to manage on-premises machines running Windows and or Linux. That's fantastic, but they're different. I can't manage them in the same way as I do with my machines in Azure. Why? Does anyone know why you couldn't? John mentioned it right at the end. Tags. You can't tag a VM that doesn't appear in Azure. This is what Azure Ark solves. It makes these machines that are not running in Azure, they could be in Amazon. I don't want them to be, but they might be. They could be in a data center in France. That makes even less sense to me, frankly. Sorry, there was another opportunity, I took it. Sorry, friends. It could be running anywhere. And with Azure Ark, I can now apply tags to them, so I can treat them in exactly the same way as I do the VMs that are running in Azure. Finally providing that single pane of glass panacea that we've been looking for so long. So if you think of it like this, we know that we've, that still makes me laugh. I literally just scratched it out and used my pen on my laptop to write servers are still on premises. That we've still got these servers on premises, and I'd like to be able to manage them in a way that I do with servers in the cloud. The same way, preferably, using the same interface. That is what Azure Ark provides. My clicker is not working. Oh, there you go, it's done it. So, here is what we get. We have the ability to take these on-premises machines, these AWS VMs, these Google VMs, and project, if you will, think of it like an avatar, a representation of them up into Azure. That then allows you to take all of these capabilities that Azure already provides to native VMs running alongside it in Azure. It can now extend those abilities to on-premises machines or machines in other clouds. Take a look at one particular example. This is high on everybody's list. Every customer we talk to, when we ask them what is the most valuable feature, usually governance is in the top 5. Update management is usually up there as well, but governance is obviously a big deal these days. So you can take a look at the scenario overview here. This is what customers are trying to do. They're trying to meet compliance needs that require complex configurations inside the guest operating system as well as outside the guest operating system, i.e. you must be onboarded to a certain service in Azure that meets the same compliance bar. The business requirements are perhaps even more complex, and these are some of the most challenging configurations that we've ever encountered. For those folks that are from Europe, the same as myself, I think Germany is probably considered top of the list in terms of the most difficult compliance bars to meet. So what we're saying here is if you combine Azure's governance capabilities in Azure Policy, guest configuration, something referred to as blueprints, with Azure Ark, you now have the ability to do this. Extend Azure Resource Manager's capabilities bring those machines in via their avatars to Azure, and now extend governance policy that is the same policy. It's the exact same policy. So you've got a policy that's now managing all your VMs that are running in Azure, a policy managing bare metal machines running in your data centers, and it's the same policy. Not a different one, not one you had to export and import somewhere else, exactly the same policy. Make one change, and ultimately it's reflected on every single one of them. So if you take a look at the overall strategy here that we've got, we've done an awful lot of work around IoT and our branding of edge devices. We know about Azure Stack Hub. It's this portable version of Azure that allows you to leverage Azure capabilities even in disconnected scenarios. We complete the pieces of that puzzle with Azure Ark by extending all of Azure's management capabilities regardless of where those machines run, as well as regardless of what operating system they run. That is our overall hybrid strategy. We believe that this is going to be the best way in which you get to manage machines at scale for both managed service providers as well as large enterprises, right the way through to the smaller shops where it's just a couple of people and they need some cloud capabilities, virtual machines or a service. That's really where we're trying to get to. So the takeaways I'd like you to have are as follows. Azure Ark is an umbrella brand with 3 specific components in it. Azure Ark for services. That's what does all that stuff I've just been talking about, where you can project an avatar. Azure Ark for Kubernetes. This allows me to project a Kubernetes cluster up into Azure and then use the same policies to manage it. And last but not least, we can run data services anywhere using Azure Data Services built on Ark. This is where you get to leverage some of the database APIs, the clever stuff that can be used in Azure. You now get to use that stuff on premises as well. If I just flip that over, there is actually a slide in here as well where we'll show you which sessions you should take a look at, because obviously all of this stuff is available. It's all recorded, all available to you guys for streaming afterwards. There are 2 sessions you should focus on to really get into that. So John, if you want to go ahead and give them a quick demo.
Sure. So here we are in my resource group that I've been using all day, and I've got my 6 Azure servers in the resource group. I've got this filtered by virtual machines. So I've also taken those 3 non-Azure servers that are sitting back in Redmond in my office, and I've onboarded those to Azure Ark. And once I've done that, as Dean mentioned, they show up as an avatar, as a resource type in Azure itself. So let's go ahead and add that resource type to my filter. Whoops. So this is of type Azure Ark machine. And now when we do that, we can see that now my physical machines show up in Azure just as my virtual machines do. If we drill into one of those, we can see they look very much like a virtual machine. So we can do things like tagging on them. So we can start applying policy to these. So for instance, we can apply policy for tagging for asset tracking. We can look at logs on these. But the most important feature that we've enabled so far is the ability to apply in-guest policy. So that in-guest policy for password restrictions that we looked at earlier for my virtual machines, now that I've onboarded my physical machines into Azure Ark, they automatically get that same policy applied to them with no changes. And we've gone into all of the standard policies that you have in Azure and updated them so that they work with Ark as well.
Great. Thank you, sir. Okay. So here's the session info. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about Ark, you can watch these at your leisure. Just stream those sessions and make sure you understand what's going on there. The first 2 are covered in the same session. Then Travis Wright from the SQL team up in Azure, he did the rest of the work. So you will be able to find his sessions with those 2 session identifiers. So 2 things totally new. We said Lighthouse as well. How many of you have already seen a session about Lighthouse or know what it is? Okay. Deployed it already, the gentleman just said. So he's right on the ball here. So Azure Lighthouse allows you to, if you like, I'll use an analog here. It's specific to my background, but a lot of people tend to understand it this way. If there were 2 organizations and they ended up having a merger and acquisition scenario, and they had 2 Active Directory forests, because almost everybody on the planet does if they're a business, you would create a trust relationship between those 2 Active Directory forests so that you could take a security principal, a user or a group, from one of those forests and give it permission to manage a resource in the other one. Azure Lighthouse does that across Azure tenant boundaries. The reason that this is necessary is because we find a lot of folks out there are doing this kind of stuff. Managed service providers, or they've got 2 tenants to truly isolate dev test from production. And for every single tenant, the management burden is increased yet again. So if I've got 2 tenants I'm managing, it's 2 times the management. If it's 10 tenants I'm managing, it's 10 times the management burden, unless I develop my own automation. Now let's take a look at what this looks like when Azure Lighthouse is in the picture. The same basic premise. We project the resources from the other tenants into a management tenant where I then apply the policies that I need to. So I'm consolidating the management burden down to a single set of management tasks using Azure Lighthouse to do that. And it's the same basic strategy. Azure Ark projects up into the cloud. Azure Lighthouse projects across tenant boundaries. The same basic underlying notions to make your lives far, far simpler. So last but not least, a little pun here. Everything we've talked to you about has been from the cloud down. So I'm using a little pun from the ground up here because we have a partner team that I used to work with, Windows Server. That's the cosign organization. They've been building some stuff as well to make Azure simpler to adopt from their side of the fence. So rather than looking from the cloud down, they're doing it from the ground up, hence my pun. The first one, the Azure Network Adapter. This is the simplest way to get a Windows server to communicate with a VNet in Azure. You deploy it using the Windows Admin Center, otherwise known as WAC. You may be familiar with that. It's our new web-based MMC-like browsing experience. You don't need a console, you don't need Win32, you don't need Windows, you just need a browser. This deploys the Azure Network Adapter, and it allows you very simply to just say, deploy an Azure Network Adapter, and now connect it to that VNet in Azure. And the end result is, you now have an IP address on that VNet, and you can communicate with the machines that are attached to it. That is the simplest point-to-site VPN technology, and we've designed it specifically for that purpose, so that people that have got machines elsewhere can trivially VPN into Azure with minimal setup, minimal technical experience, and minimal friction. That's the goal of that one. Related to that, something built by a friend of ours, Greg Casanza, he's over in the Azure networking team, Azure Extended Network. This is what Azure Extended Network does. It stops people that are concerned about moving stuff from on-premises into the cloud from having to worry about one of the most significant pieces of friction. Will it still work if I change the IP address? People are like, oh no, if I change the IP address, I guarantee it's going to break because we've got perhaps you've got some horrible legacy application that a terrible coder developed with a hard-coded IP address, and you can't fix it. Azure Extended Network allows you to do the following. Stretch that subnet all the way up into Azure and allow the IP address to come along for the ride. Like so. So with Azure Extended Network, differently from Azure Network Adapter, you literally can move the machine up into Azure and allow it to preserve its original IP address. Greg has asked me to specifically point out two things here, and they are the flip side of the same point. One, this is not your plan A. Two, this is your plan B. This is what Greg told me to say literally verbatim. What he's basically saying is if you can accept the IP address change, do that. Don't do this, because it introduces some latency and it introduces some suboptimal communication paths. That's not to say it doesn't work. It works perfectly. But it isn't as quick because there's obviously wrappers going around it. We've got different headers and footers that need to go on there. And in some cases, the traffic will go a lot further than it really needs to ideally. But it allows you to test that theory. Is this going to work if I move it into the cloud? And then you can start pushing into the, well, can I now remove the extended network and simply have a natural IP address? The penultimate service, Windows Admin Center. Windows Admin Center is the new MMC. How many of you know what an MMC is? It's almost all of you. Microsoft Management Console Structure. This is where we plug in the bolt-on like Active Directory users and computers, the event manager, domains and trust. The list just goes on and on and on. Local users and groups, DNS, DHCP. That was the way we managed Windows. A couple of years back, we decided to change that and make management simpler. We introduced this concept of the Windows Admin Center, which is a browser-based means of administering servers. Currently, it can manage Windows servers in an incredible level of depth. It's also starting now to be able to manage Active Directory, and the list of things that it can manage will only get longer. The other thing that we're doing with Windows Admin Center is we're using it to make the deployment of some of the more intelligent and modern Azure services, like Azure Ark, even simpler. So Windows Admin Center can actually deploy Azure Ark for you. So you focus Windows Admin Center onto a server, you go deploy Azure Ark, and now that machine is projected up into Azure, at which point you can start using the portal or Windows Admin Center, because it also understands some Azure capabilities, to manage that machine wherever it resides. Last but not least, the storage migration service, which is specifically designed for one core role that we see people wanting to move a lot, the file server role. They've got 3, 4, 10 file servers on premises, and they would love to have them in Azure, but the idea of having to enumerate all of the disks, all of the shares, all of the ACLs, all of the policies, the domains they're joined to, the files, the folders, and the ACLs again on the files and folders is just a monumentally complex task. So they tend to just leave them and go, ugh, why fix what isn't broken? What this tool does is it simply puts a user experience around that, goes through this consistent and scalable interface that migrates those machines for you. The end result is a flow that goes something like this. First things first, we inventory what we've got. That's stage one. So you target it against a couple of machines on-prem, the file servers, and you inventory those machines. Then you get to specify where the target is. That can be in Azure, it can be a VM all running in Azure, or you can actually tell the tool, create me a VM in Azure that is the right size based upon what the current file server on-premises is. So it would figure out the size of the file server on-premises and then go and create a VM in Azure to do the same. But the target machine doesn't even need to be in Azure. Finally, you kick off the transfer step. If something gets changed during the transfer, you can go and run it again, and it will only send over the differences. Last but not least, and this is not a mandatory step, you get to do the cutover, which is where it will go and re-register the name of the new server that's either running in Azure or elsewhere, and now the file server, the old one, can be completely decommissioned. If you combine this with Azure Extended Network, you've now got the capability to move a file server with no effort on your part and preserve the IP address if you so chose. So that really is, right there, the entire idea that John and I have been trying to convey to you. Azure isn't just this place where you run big VMs with lots of storage and some security stuff. It's about hybrid management as well. There are a huge number of components and capabilities in Azure that, instead of being tools, are offered as services. You also don't have to remove your existing on-premises management suite. This works perfectly with System Center, not only where you choose one tool from System Center, one service from Azure, you can actually use the same ones in conjunction for this delegation of, again, we'll use the Conda example of update management, and continue using System Center to provide those guardrails to make sure people comply with the policies. This really is the overall takeaway. And keep in mind, put these things together with clever permutations, Lighthouse, Ark, and an Azure management service, and you get some pretty powerful things. Add Azure Extended Network onto the end of it, you've gained a better management experience. It's hybrid, it supports both central and delegated. You didn't have to do anything to migrate it, and you didn't even have to change the IP address. It doesn't get much easier than that. So, with that said, thank you very much for watching, much appreciated, and we will consider this a wrap. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. If any of you have any questions, please feel free to come up and ask them. And as always, don't forget to fill out an evaluation. Thank you, guys.